Hello everyone, my name is Ujjwal and I'm going to introduce the programming concepts for Google Earth Engine. In this video, we'll talk about JavaScript and the Google Earth Engine API and what you need to learn to be able to start using the platform. If you are a complete beginner and have never programmed before, this video will help you learn the basic syntax of JavaScript and how to apply that in Google Earth Engine. So first things first, why JavaScript? If you are a data scientist or a remote sensing professional, JavaScript hardly seems to be the first choice of language for you. So why bother learning JavaScript at all? Well, first thing you should realize is that you need to know very little of JavaScript to be effectively able to use this in Earth Engine. Also, programming in JavaScript for Earth Engine is much simpler and easier for beginners. So you'll have a much better learning experience if you start with JavaScript. Once you learn Earth Engine, you can easily switch and port your code to Python or R very easily. So with that in mind, let's learn the basics of JavaScript language and how you can apply this in Google Earth Engine. So this is the Google Earth Engine code editor. Once you sign up for your Earth Engine account, you can just visit this URL, code.earthengine.google.co.in, and start using Earth Engine. This is also one of the advantages of using Google Earth Engine with JavaScript, that you can just visit this URL from anywhere and start using Earth Engine. There is absolutely no installation required. Here in the code editor, we have the center window, center panel here. This is where we'll type some code and we'll see the result of that immediately on the right-hand side. Below this, here's a map. So if you write a code that displays some results on a map, you'll see them here. On the left-hand side is the scripts tab. This is where you'll be saving your code. So let's just get started. The first thing you do when you're learning a new language is to learn how to print hello world. And this is a tradition that you do for every new language that you learn. And while it's just fun to do, it's also helps you understand how the system works. How do you give input to the system? How does your interpreter take this input and generate an output? And many programming languages may require 5, 6, 10 lines of code to be able to just do that. But with JavaScript, it is as simple as saying print hello world. We'll learn about what this means a bit later, but first, if you just have a line like print hello world, we can click this run button and you'll see the output here on the console and this printed hello world. So this is where you give input to the system. This is where you write your program. You click run button, the JavaScript interpreter takes your code and generates this output. Here, print is a function. A function is something that takes an input and generates an output. So the print function takes one input here, which is the text called hello world, and it prints it on the console. In JavaScript, you end every command with a semicolon. The semicolon is optional in Earth Engine, but it's usually a good practice to end all your commands with semicolon for clarity so that you know that its code is complete. Here, I can change this text to a different word and it'll give me a different output. So if I just say hello class instead of hello world and run this, you'll see that the output changed here. So the first thing you need to learn in a programming language is something called variables. Variables are used to store some values and then recall those values later in your program. In JavaScript, you define a variable with the keyword var. So you say var and then name of the variable. Here we are defining a variable called city and you assign it some value. So here we are assigning the value called Bengaluru to the name to the variable city. And the value is in single quotes, and the single quotes are used to denote that this value is a text. And that means the variable city is now text called Bengaluru stored in that variable. Let's print it. So if you print city and run the program, you will see that it prints the value that is stored in the variable. Many people ask, should I use single quotes or double quotes? JavaScript supports both. Both are okay. It's a matter of personal preference, but just be consistent. If you're using double quotes, do use double quotes everywhere. If you're using single quotes, do use single quotes everywhere. I personally prefer single quotes, but again, as I said, this is just a matter of your personal preference. All right, so this is a variable type called string. String is a text. You can also have another type of variable where you can say, I want to define a variable called population, and I want to assign the value 8.4 million to it. And now this is a variable of type number, where I've assigned this number to this variable. And if I print it, you'll see it prints the number. And you saw that I forgot the semicolon here. That's fine, that my program still worked. It gave me a warning here saying missing semicolon. So you can add it and the warning will go away. So two types of variables in JavaScript, text and numbers. All right. Next, you say variables are great. I can store some value, but you may want to store more than one value in a variable. Something like a list of things in a variable. And that can be done using another structure called list. So let's learn about how to define a list in JavaScript. So let's say I want to create a list of major cities. So I have a variable called major cities, and I want to assign it a list of cities. The list in JavaScript is defined using square braces. So from now on, you need to kind of learn to differentiate different kind of braces. The square braces are used to define list. So I have a square braces here. Inside that, I can create a list of cities. And I'm just going to create a list with the major cities in India. So the first value is Mumbai, Delhi, Chennai, and right. Here we have 4 different cities assigned to a single variable, and I could do that because I put them in a list using the square braces. Let's print this. And you can see, I can see all the 4 items in the list. Here, they are all kind of collapsed into a single line, but if I click this triangle, they will expand. This triangle is called a zippy, and you'll see this all across Earth Engine. When you print something, you'll see if there's a lot of information, they'll be collapsed under this one line where you can click this triangle and expand that. And you can see this list has 4 items. You can see this, each item has this number 0, 1, 2, 3 attached to it. And you may be wondering, where did this number come from? We just defined this 4 items, why there are additional numbers here. And these numbers are called index. This is the position of that particular item within a list. So here, Mumbai is the first element. So it's at index 0. In programming, typically counting starts from 0. So you need to unlearn how you count, and you always start counting from 0. So if you wanted the third item, you say, give me the item at index 2. So Chennai is at index 2, which is the third item. You might be also wondering, why did I write my variable name in a funny way? If you are coming from a different programming language like Python, you typically do your variables like this with underscore. And this also will work. There is no error, and my code will run exactly the same way. I can change the name of my variable. But as a standard practice, in JavaScript, you define your variables in something called a camel case. A camel case is like a hump of the camel, where you start each variable name with a small case letter. You complete the word. If your variable has more than one word, you capitalize the beginning of each word. And this is just a standard good practice which JavaScript follows. Even in Earth Engine, when you're using the Earth Engine functions, they all follow the same convention. So your code will look much more consistent if you follow the standard as well. So if my variable was called major cities in India, I would define my variable like this, where the first letter of each part of the variable name is capitalized. Okay. All right, so we learned about lists, and I'm going to add a comment here. If you start any command with 2 forward slashes, that is known as a comment. A comment means your program will have that comment, but your interpreter will just ignore it. If I run this, nothing different will happen. It'll just be there. The comments are mainly used for documentation, for explaining your code to others, and just for writing additional bits of information in your code. So we learned about lists. Here, I'll just define this is variables. The next thing we need to learn is something called a dictionary. So we learned that a list can put multiple things together. But if you had a lot of items and you put them in a list, you have to remember, did I put this item at index 2 or index 3? And you need to kind of recall using that index. But most of the time in data science, you are working with structured data. If you have structured data, each piece of data has some meaning, has some label attached to it. So it is much preferable to store this data into a structured way where you can recall each item with its label. And that can be done using a dictionary. This is also called an object in JavaScript. So let's say we want to define a dictionary called city data. So we have a variable called city data, and we define a dictionary. So dictionaries are defined using curly braces. So this is the third type of braces you're learning today. The first type of braces were round braces, which is used for functions. The second were the square braces that were used for list. And the third kind of braces are the curly braces. And the dictionaries are defined as the key value pairs. So we can just say city is right. So this means this dictionary now has 2 items. The first item is called city with a value called Bangalore. The second item is called population with the population of 8.4 million. Yeah, let's print this and see what it looks like. Right, so now it says this is an object. I can click on this zippy and say now I have 2 items stored inside this dictionary, and each item has a name. That means compare that with the list here. The list had just a 0, 1, 2, 3 versus here I can just say I have a variable called city data. Tell me what is the population of that, and you can say give me the population value and you'll get that. So this is much simpler to work with structured data. And you'll use dictionaries a lot in Earth Engine to hold any such structured data. You can also replace this with variable. So we already have a name variable called city. You can assign a variable to a key, and this will also be the same. And you can keep adding different items. Let's say I want to add one more information, say elevation. And now you see I have 3 properties. If I expand this, now there is city, elevation, and population. And these are the 3 keys. When you're writing a dictionary, it's also useful to break down this whole line into multiple lines. And that means it's much more readable. Remember, JavaScript considers a command to be over only when it encounters a semicolon. So you can say, I will break it down over multiple lines like this, and this will still work, because it'll keep looking at the next line till it encounters a semicolon. And when you have a long dictionary or long command, you can break it down into multiple lines like that. All right. So we learned about variables, lists, and cities. We learned about functions in the beginning. We learned how to call a function. We just say name of the function and give it some value in the curly braces. But in Earth Engine, you may have to define your own function. So let's learn about how to write functions. So functions are something that takes 1 or more input or 0 or more input, does something with that, and returns an output. So let's write a simple function. We write a function called greet. Right? So we'll define a variable called greet, which is a function. And the function is defined using this keyword called function. And we'll give it an input saying name. That means when you call this function and you give it some value, that value will be stored in this variable called name, and we do something with the name. So we start the function using a curly brace here, and we write the function here, and we say greeting. So we define variable called greeting, and we'll say greeting equals hello plus name, and we say return the greeting. So this is a very simple function. You give it some input, it'll give you hello plus that input. And the most important thing when writing the function is that you need to specify a return value. If you forget to have a return value, then you will get null as an output. And many times you say, I wrote this function, but it's not working. It's not giving me expected results. Check if you forgot to add a return statement. The syntax here is slightly complex, but once you practice writing it, you'll get used to this. So let's see how to call this function. So let's say I want to call this function greet with some input called world. Okay. So if I call this function greet world, this function will be called with this input world. It will be assigned to this variable name. Inside the function, it will create a variable called greeting, which will be hello plus world, and it'll return that greeting. So let's see what was the output of that. We'll just print that. And you saw that now it returns hello world. The advantage of having a function versus just writing code as it is that you can reuse it. Now imagine I want to just give it a different input, and without having to change any code, I get different output. So this is useful where you write a function that does some kind of processing, you give it different inputs, and you get output based on that. So they are very helpful in defining what your operations look like. So let's keep learning. Or wait, we are done. This is all the JavaScript you need to know to be able to use Earth Engine. And you might be wondering, oh, we just learned about variables, lists, dictionaries, and functions, and are we done? You didn't even teach us how to add true numbers or how to do any data processing. Well, for doing any operations or any data processing, you won't be using JavaScript at all. Even if you use Earth Engine from Python, you'll only need to know how to do these basic things, because for any kind of data processing, you'll be using the Google Earth Engine API. And that's what we're going to learn next. So what is an API? API stands for Application Programming Interface. This is just a fancy way of saying that you'll use the Earth Engine functions for doing any data processing. APIs are useful because they hide how things are done. So Earth Engine will be able to do many, many complex things. You'll do image processing, you'll process vector data, but all of this is done by the Earth Engine servers. And you just need to say, I need to compute an index. And you just specify the function that does this. You don't need to worry about how it's implemented. Earth Engine will figure out the best way to distribute that processing over multiple computers and give you the result. So using the API is helpful because you can just know which function to use, and then the processing will be taken care of by the system. The API remains exactly the same, whether you use it from JavaScript, Python, R, or even now Julia. So learning Earth Engine API is the core of what you'll be spending most of your time as you're learning Earth Engine. Learning basics of JavaScript was important because that's how we'll specify which function to use, how to call that function, and defining that basic structure of your program. But all the heavy lifting is done by the API. So let's see this with an example. So let's say I have a variable called number, and its value is 1. Okay. I want to add 1 to it. So I just want to know how to add 2 numbers. Maybe I want to do 1 plus 1 in Earth Engine. Well, to do this, you don't need to know how to do this in JavaScript because you have the Earth Engine API for doing this. Now, how do I use the Earth Engine API? How do I know where the functions are? Well, all the documentation is right here in the Docs tab. So since I'm doing something with number, I will go and find the number module here. So you can see there's a module called ee.number. And everything that starts from EE is an Earth Engine API function, and you can use that to do any operations. So I'll expand this, and these are all the different functions that are part of the number module. You'll see that there is a function called add. And if you click on it, you'll see the documentation right here. So if you have a number, you can call add function on this and it'll give you the output value. So let's see, I have a new variable called new number, which I want to add 1 to this number. First, I need to create an ee.number out of my variable. So if I call ee.number of number, that means it'll take this value 1, turn it into an Earth Engine object, which you can then call Earth Engine functions on it. And now I can just say .add 1. And let me print the new number to see what is the output. And you'll see that Earth Engine will compute this and give you the answer as 2. Now, this code is exactly the same if you do this via Python or any other language. That means you use JavaScript just to define your number and then print the result. Rest, everything is done using the Earth Engine API. And that's why when I say you need to know very, very basics of JavaScript just to define the structure of your program and call the Earth Engine API functions. The rest, everything is done using the Earth Engine API. Let's see another example. Let's say I want to create a list of numbers from 1 to 10. I can create a list like this. Remember the square braces, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. I can do 1 to 10, but that's quite tedious. What if I wanted a list of 1 to 1,000? This is not a very efficient way. So how do I create a list automatically? Well, there are ways to do this in JavaScript using for loops and other things, but you don't need to use this. We'll just create a list using Earth Engine API. What function to use? Well, let's just find out. So you switch to the docs tab, go under ee.list and browse around and find a function that does that. As you go around in the list, you'll see there's this function ee.list.sequence. If you open it up, you'll see it generates a sequence of numbers and it takes 2 arguments, the start and end. And there are some optional arguments as well. Let's see how we can use this. So list.sequence 1 to 10. And I run this and you'll see that Earth Engine API will generate that list and print it for me. You can see now I have 10 elements. So this was just a quick demonstration to show that you'll be spending most of your time and energy in learning the appropriate Earth Engine API functions. And the languages that you use that API from is largely irrelevant. If you are a complete beginner, I suggest you practice writing some code and get familiar with the JavaScript syntax that will help you as you learn more complex concepts. If you get stuck at any point in time or you get an error, go back in the video and see what is the right syntax for doing this. Thank you.